Okay, so thanks a lot for everybody to join this meeting. We as you know, we co-organize with Helios, Ronnie, and Sergey. And our guest today is Francesco Trebbi. He doesn't need much introduction. He's a very famous scholar on political economics. He's currently at Berkeley, Haas. He's a research associate of NBR, CEPR. He has held a variety of editorial positions, won prizes, etc., and published very widely top publications that are very influential. So thanks so much, Francesco, to be with us. The floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Dominic. It's really a pleasure to be here with you. Just to introduce this discussion, so this is joint work with Nathan Canen at the University of Houston and Chad Kendall at the University of Southern California. They're both here to help us with the chat. It's work on political polarization. So it's as for many of you, this is not an unfamiliar topic. Is one of the main issues of the day. We know that society is highly polarized, and where is the data coming from to support that statement? Well, most of it comes from polarization of elites, and by elites we really mean the political elites. So congressional members and in general politicians. The evidence comes, for instance, from an extensive line of research within political science, and this paper is going to borrow and talk a lot to this literature in political science. And I think we, as political economists from the economic side, we owe some sort of debt of gratitude to these scholars for opening the way in many of these issues and to kind of entertain a discussion with us. So Nolan McCarthy, for instance, at Princeton, and Keith Poole and Howard Rosenthal have done an extensive amount of work in documenting polarization of politicians, but also the work of Jim Snyder at Harvard on surveying politicians has shown similar trends over time. We've seen patterns of congressional speech that have shown clear signs of division across party lines. For instance, the work of Matt Gansko, Jesse Shapiro, and others on congressional speech. And then there is also evidence, for instance, from Adam Bonica at Stanford on the polarization of campaign donations, which is another area that is corollary but indicates some degree of polarization in the elites. Now, many of you have worked on another area of polarization, which is polarization of voters, of electoral polarization, or polarization at the level of individual members of society. Part of it has been documenting polarization in terms of policy. The evidence there is a little bit more ambiguous. And another form of polarization, which we call affective polarization, which really kind of focuses on the animosity between members of different parties. So this kind of paints a picture that is a little bit segmented. You have clear evidence of polarization at the top, some degree of evidence of polarization at the voter level, where you have a lot of affective animosity happening right now. Not much in the way of policy. For instance, Maurice Fiorina has documented this in a series of influential articles. Now, why is it important that we study this? Again, this seems a little bit redundant given our crowd and community and the work that we do as political economists, but just to remind, this is correlated and probably also causally important for policy uncertainty. When political parties and members of parties cannot talk to each other, the government policy-making abilities are affected negatively. There is work, for instance, by Steve Davis and co-authors on the role of increasing policy uncertainty. Think about electoral cycles and so on and so forth. Also, there is some early work on income inequality that predates the wave of work that we have done within economics in the post-financial crisis analysis that looks at the correlation between political polarization and income inequality and shows some kind of intriguing patterns of correlation. So these are all things that make us interested in this. And the typical piece of evidence that you see in this type of analysis when it comes to elite polarization is a picture like this one, this kind of U-shaped polarization pictures where you have a time series here, where you have, say, the 1890s and the recent times being highly polarized, both in the House and the Senate. The Senate is in blue and the House in red in here. And basically what you have here is some sort of measure of polarization. And this polarization here is going to be the essence of the topic. We want to measure this and attribute to a certain extent its main determinants, its main drivers to certain elements. Now, what is a little bit less known is where this measure is coming from. Where is this picture coming? Where is the data from this coming from? And it comes from essentially looking at the distribution of ideologies in Congress. Suppose these are your Republicans, and maybe you have your Democrats, and you've estimated some form of distribution of their ideological positions, where the idea is that these measures here are parameters of preferences of politicians that are used to essentially explain vote choices made by these politicians in Congress. And when you're thinking about polarization, you're really thinking about these distributions moving apart. And the distance between these medians is what is traced here in this graph. So this analysis here of these parameters is what is at the core of our paper. We want to understand where elite polarization is coming from. Now, in the picture that I just showed you, it looks like it's all coming from the preferences of politicians. It's a discrete choice, random utility framework where you're estimating some sort of politician fixed effect that determines essentially how normally that politician votes. And depending on whether that politician lines up on a conservative liberal scale more or less to the right, then that's the ideological position of that member. But obviously, when you're thinking about explaining votes of politicians, the preferences of the politicians per se are not necessarily the only element in the choice. Why am I saying this? Well, politicians are members of groups, organizations, and those organizations are called political parties, and they have a specific structure of leadership. And in this structure of leadership, there are forces and incentives that are applied. Think about having the possibility of sitting in a congressional committee that is particularly useful to you as a politician, that is going to be awarded by the party leadership only under conditions of you, for instance, casting some sort of controversial votes, at least controversial from the perspective of the preferences of voters in your congressional district. So the idea of looking at vote choices of politicians as simply determined by preferences, we find in our work is reductive. It shouldn't be just preferences. There should be a role, for instance, for party discipline. And this is important because essentially allows us to understand how much of the current complicated situation of polarization is driven by voters electing more extreme politicians, replacing less extreme, more moderate members, versus party leaders like Mitch McConnell or Nancy Pelosi becoming better or more forceful in essentially enforcing the party line. And this is important because when you're thinking about this problem, if it's coming from voters, if it's voters electing essentially more extreme politicians with ideological positions that sit at the extreme of the support of those ideologies, that's an electoral problem, and maybe there is nothing you want to do about it. But if it's instead the party leadership that is following a specific political strategy, enforcing party control and discipline, then maybe by asking parties to do something different, you can change things. Now, the problem with this analysis is that from the econometric perspective is extremely complicated in terms of identification. And the reason is the following. Suppose you're thinking about explaining votes of politicians, okay? And these votes may come from both unobserved preferences and unobserved party discipline because you don't know what's happening behind the scenes. You may have that a specific group of politicians vote in a very unified way because they have exactly the same preferences, or because they have heterogeneous preferences, but the parties are strong enough to make them all vote the same way. So you can see that observationally in terms of choices, these two scenarios are going to be identical, but from the analysis of the main mechanisms that produce this polarization, they are absolutely different. One is coming from preferences, the other one is coming from party strategies. Okay, so resolving this is going to be an objective of our paper. On top of that, just to complicate things a little bit more, parties may also pursue only those bills on which their members agree. This is a problem of agenda setting, essentially. And if you're only voting on things that you think are non-divisive within our party, then it's going to look like your party is very cohesive. That's kind of the general intuition behind this agenda setting mechanism behind polarization. And that's an additional complication. And our model and our approach is going to try to essentially address all these issues. So let me, after this brief introduction, let me tell you exactly what we are set to do in this work with Nathan and Chad. So we are going to try to explain this vote. So we're going to focus on congressional voting and essentially elite polarization. And we're going to apply a standard spatial voting model. And by spatial voting model, I mean you vote for the policy, either the status quo or whatever alternative is on the table, based on which one is closer to your ideal point. And you're going to have a random utility framework. So there's going to be some sort of stochastic element of preferences on top of some deterministic component. It's going to be an environment where there are multiple dimensions. So think about not just economically conservative or liberal for a politician, but maybe a second dimension related to the stance of that particular member of Congress on, say, civil rights. There's going to be a role for party discipline. So there's going to be this kind of latent structure of incentives that the party puts in place to whip politicians in voting with the party line. And then there is going to be a general agenda setting framework that basically in our paper is equivalent to selecting only those issues for which it's worthwhile for you to vote on. Okay, and in this environment, we can prove in a constructive way identification of our model using data, so on choices. So these are going to be what we call in this literature roll call votes. So vote actual yes or no's of politicians, but also adding to this information on what the party wants, what the party leadership is voting. So for instance, on a specific bill, the party leadership may vote yes, and you know who the party leaders are, so you observe their votes. So you do have this information for entire analysis that we perform. This analysis is performed for the US Congress in the period between 1927 and 2018. This period is chosen because this is the period over which a well-defined structure of leadership in the two political parties in the United States Congress can be clearly identified. Before 1927, there is a leadership structure in the House. There is no leadership structure in the Senate, and it's all seniority based. And so we wanted to make a difference there. We have also extended our analysis now to the early 20th century, though. Okay, just in terms of literature, many of you are familiar with this literature on polarization, but just to remind you of what's available in terms of analysis, essentially the short version of this is a lot. So there is a huge amount of work on American politics from this structural perspective. Maybe it's less well known, but structural econometrics is alive and well even within political science, because, for instance, the Poole and Rosenthal framework is essentially a structural framework of estimating preferences and dates back to the 80s. But also within economics, James Ekman and Jim Snyder have done work on these very same topics in the 90s, published on RAND. There's work by Douglas Rivers and Clinton, Jackman, and Rivers using different type of approaches relative to Poole, Rosenthal, and McCarty. But essentially, we are really standing on the shoulders of giants here. There is we are entering a massively dense literature of which we are well aware. Concerning party effects, which is kind of at the core of what we're trying to achieve here, we want to be able to say this much polarization is coming from the party leaders, this much is coming from voters electing extremists. So in this kind of literature, we have work on the history of Congress by Jeff Jenkins. We have work by Jim Snyder and Tim Grosclose on identifying party effects using specific assumptions on what bills are whipped and which ones are not. And then you also have some sort of methodological innovation on the Bayesian approach. But as many of you who know me are aware, I tend to repeat myself. So some of the work here is going to be, to a certain extent, redundant to some previous work that we've done with Nathan and Chad. This work you may be familiar with it, but is essentially focusing on very similar questions, but uses a completely different identification strategy, and one that kind of ultimately left us not completely satisfied with the answers we were getting. So let me maybe spend a little bit of time in showing you what is another way of addressing this idea of identifying party effects. In this past work, which is quite different from what we show today in terms of identification, we use whip count data, so internal party records essentially, to identify a role for parties. So we look at how people declare they're going to vote before party pressure, incentives, and carrots and sticks are dished out. And in this work, because it's restricted by having this whip count data, we can only work on 10 years between the 70s and 80s. And in that specific framework, the identification of party effects comes from looking at people that declare, say, to vote against the party at time 0, and then in favor of the party at time 1. And this kind of switchers essentially tell you roughly how much pressure is exercised, how much party discipline is exercised. But obviously, for this, you need to have this kind of secret party records that you need to dig out from archives. Turns out that Professor Evans at the College of Williams and Mary had done that work, so we used that data. But in that particular analysis, we couldn't look at what's happening right now. We couldn't look at second dimensions of choices, which are important in the 60s and 70s. And essentially, we can't really have an historical account for ideological polarization over the 20th century, which is really one of our objectives. So what do we find in this work? Well, when we apply our model, well, first of all, we need to show this kind of can be done, can be identified econometrically. So we have a constructive proof of identification. We show that essentially party discipline is a significant driver of voting in Congress in every congressional cycle since the 20s. So to do this, we use standard model selection tests where we show that, with high level of precision, the hypothesis that there is no role for party discipline can be rejected. Quantitatively, party discipline is a massive driver of polarization. About 65 to 75% of polarization in voting of politicians comes from the party leaders, forcing them in some form or another in voting the party line. And at the same time, the story of ideological polarization, of more extreme politicians entering politics, that was at the core of the McCarthy, Poole, and Rosenthal analysis, or the Jim Snyder's work. That is also confirmed. You have that ideological polarization is increasing over time, monotonically since the 1920s. We find also that basically there is a component of this coming from both parties, not necessarily just from Republicans. Although the Republican Party, I'm going to show you, has the bulk of the curvature over time in terms of change of their median position of the parties. We show robustness of this identification structure to several different forms of agenda setting and discipline specification. And we actually mark very clearly what are the differences between our approach and the standard DW nominate approach, which is essentially the workhorse model, the state of the art up to now in this area of research. Okay, now let me move on to the model, because I want to give you a sense of what is the structure that is applied to this kind of data. So before we start, I want to give you a sense of what type of data you're working with. Okay, think of every congressional cycle, which is a 2-year cycle, as a gigantic matrix where the rows of this matrix are essentially politicians, so members of Congress, and the columns of the matrix are specific bills that are voted on the floor of the House or the Senate. For today, we're going to work on the House. So you have this gigantic matrix of zeros and ones, and that's all the data you have. Now, obviously, this matrix can be decomposed in many ways. You can think about, say, applying a principal component analysis to this matrix if you want to find out what are the principal components of this voting matrix. And to a certain extent, many of you have an intuition of DW nominate as essentially some form of factor analysis or principal component analysis of this matrix. But in reality, that is not what is done. Okay, what's done is set up a model of preferences of politicians and vote decisions that explains the ones and the zeros, essentially the choice of a one versus the choice of a zero, the choice of voting in favor of an alternative versus against the alternative, meaning in favor of the status quo. Okay, so this is the starting point, and DW nominate essentially does that. It's a standard random utility model with unbounded shocks. We take that framework and we essentially start, that's kind of our starting point. We have two parties, the Democrats and Republicans, that compete for votes over a series of bills from T to capital T. So this is the number of columns of that matrix. So and think of that number as being large as the number of rows is large. So we also have a ton of politicians. There is a status quo QT on a specific bill, and then there is an alternative that is presented to that bill or not. So it's possible that there are votes that you never see. That is, potentially you could decide to open a floor vote on, I don't know, gun rights right now, but you don't because it's not the right time. So in our model, this is actually, we address this. But for now, let's only focus on the bills that you actually see in equilibrium, okay? Politicians have a two-dimensional ideological space. So in our notation here, you'll see there are these upper bars. They indicate that it's a vector. So politician I has an ideological point given by theta 1i and theta 2i. And theta 1i typically would identify the first dimension, which is typically associated with this economically conservative or liberal position of the politician, okay? Now, policies are also obviously bidimensional, so you have vectors, there is a status quo Q, and there is an alternative X. And the choice of politician I of supporting either Q or X is given by this form of preferences. You have a general utility function U. The only requirement on this U is that it's monotonically decreasing in the argument. And what's the argument of that utility function? The argument of the utility function is essentially some form of distance. So this is kind of, say, a Euclidean norm of the distance between the status quo, sorry, the policy, Qt, that can be either Q or X, and this element here. And what is this element here? This has two components. There is an ideal point of the politician, omega IT, and there is a role for party that can affect that distance, making it larger or smaller. Okay, so that's kind of the way in which the party is going to affect choices. But for 1 second, let's focus on the ideal point. This omega IT ideal point has two components. There is a deterministic fixed component of the politician. So this is the theta I that I was mentioning before. And then there is a stochastic element of the bliss point of that politician that is different for every particular bill, that essentially is a random utility component in choices. Now, one difference between the standard version of the random utility model and this is that the shocks are inside the argument of the utility function, as opposed to being outside in the form of u something plus epsilon. So you don't have this here. And the reason why you don't want to do that is because it looks like nice and additively separable, but actually this form here complicates things enormously from the estimation perspective, and we show that. So you don't want to have this type of approach here. Let me show you exactly how this works. Forget for 1 second about party whipping and discipline. Okay, so we absent party whipping. Politician I votes for XT over QT if obviously the utility of voting for X is larger than the utility of voting for Q. And because the utility function is monotonically decreasing, that's just equivalent to looking at the distance between the ideal point and the policy X versus the distance of the ideal point of I and the status quo. And if this distance is shorter, then you vote for X as opposed to vote for Q. And what this means is that essentially in the plane where politicians are positioned, there is going to be a cut line that is given by a slope and an intercept that is obviously a function of where X and Q are. And this cut line is going to divide politicians that vote for X versus politicians that vote for Q. So for instance, in the graph that you see below, you have a bunch of politicians here that may prefer this X to Q. And typically in this case, this bunch of Democrats here are going to prefer X. These Republicans are going to prefer Q. But then there is a subgroup of Democrats that are also going to vote for Q. This is absent party discipline. So this is how you need to think about the choice space in this environment. These are just the contours of the densities. These are the 3D densities in this environment, okay? So now what's interesting is that this cut line here is unique. However, this is without party discipline. So these Democrats here, absent party discipline, are going to vote against their party, okay? And we need to address the fact that some of these individuals may be exposed, told to vote and with their specific party leadership. Now, in this environment, it's very, very important that we are specific about our assumptions, okay? Now, I'm not going to try to sell you this model as a model that is very general in the following sense. It's not like you can have any form of preference shocks and so on and so forth. Like it's not the case when you're estimating any model of any structural model of choice. You know, I don't think many of you believe that their preference shocks are extreme value distributed IID across their choices, but somehow we make these assumptions. Now, in our environment, we have to make assumptions that are similar, of similar strength. So first of all, the shocks here are assumed to be ideological. So this is a difference relative to other approaches. We make them enter the utility function directly. The gain from this is that you do not need to recover the policy points X and Q. You can just straight up estimate the cut line and the direction of the vote. So you save parameters when you're estimating this. And saving parameter means it's easier for you to achieve econometric identification of the structural model. Okay, so the shocks here could be multidimensional, right? But moving essentially every politician around this theta centroid of their ideal points in all dimensions, in all directions. But to simplify things, we are assuming that the shocks move the ideal points orthogonally to the separating cut line. I'm sorry. What does it mean orthogonally to the separating cut line? So think about this as opposed to being the space of exposed ideal points, meaning the omegas, to being just thetas. Then the shock goes orthogonal to the cut line and can move away or in the direction of the cut line. So we have essentially just a unidimensional distribution along this direction, as opposed to having a point and having shocks that can move you in all sorts of directions. Why is this not restrictive? It's not restrictive because essentially it doesn't matter all these directions. What it matters is that you're moving here, you're here, and the distance from the line is here for your vote. What matters is that essentially how far away you are from the cut line. And essentially this approach does that using, as opposed to a multidimensional shock distribution, a unidimensional one, which is a massive computational gain. And shocks are unbounded, meaning they can move you an infinite amount away from where you are, and they realize after the choice of the agenda is made. These are kind of standard assumptions in this kind of environments, but they're super useful to address issues of agenda setting. In the paper, we formally show that under these assumptions, the agenda setting problem that we mentioned before by Cox and McCubbins and so on and so forth is not an issue. It is an issue if you're using other estimators, for instance, optimal classifiers and so on and so forth, where you do actually may have situations where people have different preferences but vote exactly the same way. But in our environment, that is not the case. You're going to be always in a situation where you can tell two people apart when they're voting, if you have essentially asymptotic on the capital T direction. The discipline element of the paper, which is really the innovation, how do you model the discipline structure here? Well, we're assuming that essentially there is a bunch of people within each party that is essentially the enforcers. Now, these enforcers in congressional politics are called whips. There is a party leadership element of this. The whip is the second highest ranked member of the party. Just to give you a sense, both Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi, before becoming their party leaders, they were whips with a capital W, and each whip has a bunch of deputy whips that go and try to essentially count votes and twist arms in specific situations. So we are assuming that there are these party whips that go around and they get rewarded a certain fixed amount for every vote that they bring to the party. Each party whip oversees a certain number of politicians and gets rewarded for bringing people into the fold. Because there is a cost of moving people, and that cost is proportional to the distance of that individual from the cut line, meaning it's more costly for the whip to convince a politician that is further away from the cut line, but the reward is actually constant because a yes is a yes from the perspective of a party leadership in terms of passing a bill. Then essentially what this means is that an individual I is going to be whipped to vote with the party line if it's a distance from the cut line is smaller than a certain threshold, which really means we're going to model this party discipline as finding a second cut line, which is how far the party is willing to whip into bringing people that otherwise would vote against the party into the fold, into the party direction. So just to give you a sense, you will see this graphically very easily. So this is our original cut line. This is exactly the same picture as before. Think about whipping in our model as basically the ability of the Democrats to essentially bring individuals that would otherwise vote against them and vote with the Republican into voting with the Democrats, essentially because there is this blue now, this new blue cut line here that it's identified by this function here, that is essentially the same cut line as before, minus some sort of bill-specific shifter, which is essentially given by how far the party can reach out and bring people in. So if you had the Democrat here, for instance, that Democrat would be allowed to vote with the Republicans in this particular bill because this person is too far away, cannot be brought into the fold. So obviously you don't whip anyone here, but you would whip individuals here and bring them to vote with the Democrats, okay? So, and the same for Republicans. And the strength of the party discipline parameter that we're estimating is how far from the essentially natural cut line these lines are. So for instance, in this particular case, we show a Democratic Party that is more stronger than a Republican Party because their discipline parameter is actually bigger. You can reach further into the fold of dissidents and corral them in into voting with the party line. And this basically is the structure that determines that, and the discipline parameter that is party specific and Congress specific, so it's going to be completely flexible over time and across parties, is estimated within our model. Okay, so this is kind of the basic elements of the model. Once you have these basic elements of the model, you can actually construct the likelihood contribution of each vote choice. So you can build your standard probabilities coming from the choices based on the model. And the parameters that you're going to estimate are the discipline parameter, the preference parameter, and the positions of the cut line, so the intercept and the slope of the cut line. When you're looking at this likelihood contributions, they look completely standard, other than there is this disciplined element here, and there is another element that we need to estimate, which is where exactly X is versus Q. You can be in this situation, you can be in this situation, you can be in a situation where you're like this. So you need to estimate that as an element of the problem. And in the paper, we show how. Is this magic? I mean, where is the, if this is kind of a standard random utility problem, how come this is not the same as DW nominate? Well, there is this element here, and this element here requires data. Where is the data? The data is this WPT. This WPT tells you how the leadership is voting on that particular bill. So this is, for instance, the direction of whipping or of what the party wants on that particular bill. And this comes from this leadership data that we have, which is we know how Mitch McConnell wanted to vote on a specific bill. And so we can see how individuals that would otherwise vote against the Republican leadership are brought in that particular bill. Now, just to give you a sense of where identification intuition comes from, suppose I see you, I estimate your ideal point where you're whipped to the right, and when you're whipped to the left, meaning I'm trying to push you, and let's think about this in the unidimensional framework. Suppose you may be whipped to vote more conservatively or liberally than you would otherwise do. And this can always happen because parties can whip in all directions. And there are situations where the status quo is so extreme that both parties want to bring the new alternative closer to their ideal points, okay? Then in that case, I'm going to be able to see the way you vote when you're whipped to the right and when you're whipped to the left. And by essentially looking at where the midpoint is, I can tell where your real ideal preferences are. And the amplitude of this interval tells me how strong the party is in moving you away from your ideal point. So this is kind of the intuition of why this really helps, because I know how you vote when this WPT is 1 and when it's -1. And so I can tell exactly where the midpoint is going to be for each of these politicians, recovering the theta i's and also the parameters of the cut lines on top of the ideal of the discipline parameter. Now, in this paper, we spell out very, very clearly what are the identifying assumptions for this model. You need to have a set of identifying assumptions in these environments. This is not assumption free. You need to have ideal points that are not perfectly collinear. Think about it this way. If you had ideal points that were perfectly collinear, you wouldn't need 2 dimensions. You would just need 1. You would, a unidimensional problem is much easier to identify, and we identify in the econometrica paper that we have, and we show that clearly. We also need to assume that there exists a politician 0 that tells you where the origin is. This is just to essentially locate the cloud of ideal points of politicians somewhere in space. So this is an assumption about location. There has to be a politician K with a known first dimension. So this basically tells you say the conservative level of I don't know, Ted Kennedy is this much, and this is important just to determine scale of that problem, so that this cloud as a metric for the first dimension. Then there has to be a bill 0 such that it's flat, meaning essentially this bill here is horizontal in our space. The reason why you need to have some normalization like this is because that's going to pin down the rotation of this problem. And then there exists a bill that is with a slope different from 0, just because if all bills are parallel to each other, then the problem again becomes a unidimensional problem, and we want to have a multidimensional problem. So you need to have at least 2 bills that have cut lines that have different angles relative to the origin. Then we need to have essentially that both parties whip in the same direction on certain bills and in other directions on other bills. Now, you know that this happens because in the data you do have leaders of the Republican and Democrats sometimes voting in the same way. And this actually happens for about 20% of the bills. They may be both voting yes or both voting no. And just in case there are some real experts here of congressional politics, this is not just a motion to reconsider type of votes. This actually happens. The reason why you may have bills like that is that there are some sort of historical remnants that need to be modified and brought closer to the preferences of the 2 parties, or there are some bills that are proposed that are extreme for both parties and they don't want them, but they're still allowed to be voted on, maybe as a reward to certain politicians or to allow certain fringes of the party to have a say. But this is also something that we can easily verify in the data. Estimation is via maximum likelihood, and this model is really extensively validated. I think we did a ton of due diligence on this. Initial points were assessed very carefully here, and it's fully replicable. Now, just in case you wonder why you need whipping in opposite directions and in the same direction, is that for every bill, you have 2 cut lines for Democrats and Republicans, and you need to be able to interpret the distance between these 2 cut lines. If you don't know this, you won't be able to tell whether it's the sum or the difference of the 2 y-maxes here. So that is why you need whipping in both directions. The model can be estimated without this assumption, but then you lose the ability of saying, in this particular Congress, this is the strength of the Democrats and this is the strength of the Republicans. You only identify some combination of the 2 elements. Now, this is basically going back to the intuition for this estimator, okay? I'm gonna go over it again because I think it's important that you understand that this is not magic, that once you see how the party is voting, and you know that they want a certain things and someone votes against that, it means something very important. And when a person that you would assume based on previous vote to vote against that votes with the party, you know that that individual has been whipped, okay? So if you can observe the ideal point of member I when she's whipped to the left, and you can observe the ideal point of the same member when she's whipped to the right, which you can because you know when they're whipped in what direction, and assuming that whipping is symmetrical, meaning within a Congress, the structure of discipline is the same, you can take the midpoint and you can recover information about where really that politician is located, okay? This is not the exact intuition. The model is multidimensional, so this is an intuition for a unidimensional model, but it gives a sense of how the estimator interprets within individual changes when the information on the leadership vote is given, so that you see how differently they behave. Now, in terms of whipping structure, you need to make a certain number of assumptions, and I want to show you that the model is robust to these assumptions in the sense that we can modify the assumptions on whipping and get estimates of party discipline over time that are similar. We estimated the model assuming that every bill is whipped. But what if there is no whipping, there is no discipline applied when both the Democrats and the Republicans agree? We can estimate the model in that environment, okay? We can drop bills where the leader of the party and the second in command, the whip in the party, vote in opposite directions, meaning you can actually think of divided votes within the party leadership as being somewhat noisy, and you can drop them. You can estimate a model where there is no whipping on bills that have particularly large margins. So for instance, lopsided bills of the 65 to 35% success or 70 to 30. These are the splits of bills that Snyder and Grosclose used in their analysis in 2000 for party effects. Now, they used these lopsided bills in their model to actually estimate party effects, because if you have a certain set of bills where you know that parties are not using discipline, you can use those bills to identify preferences and then use those preferences on the bills where there is party discipline to separate party discipline from preferences and get the estimate of party discipline. So they use that from that purpose, but we don't need that for identification. We already have identification using at the direction of the leadership votes. And therefore, we only use no whipping on lopsided bill as essentially as a proof or robustness of our model to what set of bill is actually seeing discipline applied. Now I'm going to move on to data and results. So first of all, this time series here shows you the amount of data that we have, which really is thousands of votes, thousands of politicians, and also votes where both parties vote in the same direction, both parties vote in opposite direction. Some of the time they both vote yes, they both vote no, and so on and so forth. So you do actually have asymptotics on all sorts of directions. So you have, say, almost at the yearly basis, you have around 500 bills or more than that. A good chunk of those are voters voting in the opposite direction. Some of them, they both vote yes. There is a whole subset here that is omitted where both vote no. But you have a ton of information. And this is really why all this essentially quote unquote politician fixed effects and bill fixed effects can be estimated, because you do have asymptotics both on the capital T and, if you wish, the capital N in terms of number of politicians in each Congress. For whipping direction, so this is how the leadership votes. We literally take the vote of the leader in the roll call, so the way Mitch McConnell votes, and so we can code that as a yes or no. For the majority and minority leader, when the votes are unavailable, sometimes the majority and minority leaders abstain or they're not in the chamber, we use the whips, or otherwise we use the majority of the party vote, okay? So we do have information on this data, WPT, for every single bill in Congress. And that's very important. That's the main difference between our previous work. We can apply this method over the entire time series from the 20s to today. And this is what this graph shows. It's a time series of party strength, of party discipline over time, where you do see that party discipline is now at historical maxes. Now, these are point estimates of party discipline Congress by Congress. So think about the strength of the party being variable over time, and the two parties generally having different strengths. So for instance, for most of the 20th century, essentially, the Republicans are stronger than Democrats. There is a little bit of a reversal here at the bottom. And then you do see this huge increase in party discipline starting from the mid-80s to today. And this is not surprising. We know that this is essentially a turning point in polarization. But what this is showing you is that party discipline is behaving the same way as the DW nominate behaves. Now, the only problem is the DW nominate attributes everything to extreme politicians. But what we're saying here is that parties here are becoming stronger, and therefore you cannot attribute necessarily everything in terms of parties voting in a cohesive way only to the fact that parties are more homogeneous internally or they have more extreme politicians. A part of it must be coming from the technology of the parties. Now, just to make sure, we do see even in our data that the ideological polarization of members of Congress is occurring. Those two distributions that I talked about at the beginning, the Republicans and the Democrats, are coming apart. They are moving apart. Okay, but these magnitudes here are not comparable to the magnitudes of party discipline. In fact, if you're looking at the share of polarization in votes in Congress that comes from party discipline, that's very, very large. It's about 70% of the polarization, at least the one across the first dimension, that you can totally attribute to party discipline. Now, how you measure this share of polarization is a little bit complicated in multiple dimensions, but a good intuition from one dimension is you compare the magnitude of the party discipline parameters to the distance in the ideal points of politicians, the median ideal points of politicians across the two parties, and you show that the party discipline is actually a massive driver in a relative sense. Okay, in terms of model fit, our model has an excellent fit. As you can imagine, when you are comparing your model with DW nominate, you better have almost ideal performance, and we do, fortunately. So right now we're correctly predicting 90% of the individual choices. When you're looking at the dynamics over time of polarization, you do see patterns that are at the same time familiar but intriguing. So think about this graph here as showing you over time the position of the median Democrat and the position of the median Republican. So what you see is that up until the 60s, both parties were drifting to the left in the ideological scale. So this is essentially a conservative and liberal. So both parties up until the 60s were going this way. And then roughly around the Civil Rights Act, you do have Republicans drifting, and Democrats also keep drifting, but at a slower angle relative to before. And in the paper, we discuss also the role of Northern and Southern Democrats. This is an important element of the discussion, the sorting of politicians across parties that happens in the 60s. And you clearly see that there is a convergence between the Southern Democrats and the Republicans that then kind of changes this trajectory. It's a little bit richer. I mean, this is a richer picture of what I just showed you before. It shows you the exact position on the first dimension of the two parties, Democrats and Republicans, and then you do see also the change in higher moments with respect to the time series. So you do actually have a lot of heterogeneity within party in the 60s and much more homogeneity within parties nowadays. And this is super important when you're going to talk about theory of political parties. Now, in terms of whipping assumptions, I showed you before a claim of robustness. Now I'm going to prove you that essentially our model, the Snyder-Gross-Close model assumptions, the no whipping when party leaders disagree, the dropping party leadership ambiguities doesn't change things in terms of total party strength. This is the time series that shows all these models that essentially they are largely overlapping and show similar dynamics, where basically what they say is that nowadays that's no matter what your assumption on whipping, nowadays is the peak time of party strength. And so a lot of responsibility of what's going on today in American politics must be related to party leaderships. I'm going to skip this slide here. You may wonder whether we have checked if our identification approach delivers the same result as the identification approach in our previous work, where we use the whip counts and essentially the confidential party records. And we do show a correlation between our estimates and the ones in our previous work that use this different identification that is 88%. So to us, this was very important because it's reassuring that this assumption of identification delivers something that can be corroborated with alternative data. There is a whole discussion in our paper about the differences between our approach and DW nominate. I'm not going to go over it in our analysis here. Some of this discussion is more technical, but it's very important to understand that when you are using our method, a politician that has an ideal point of 0, for instance, in our model, when is a Democrat in DW nominate is going to look a lot more liberal, and when the same politician with the same ideal point at 0 is Republican, is going to look a lot more conservative. And the reason why there is this gap is that essentially DW nominate omits a role for party discipline, doesn't consider that a Democrat that sits here is typically whipped to the left, and a Republican that sits here is typically whipped to the right, and therefore appears more conservative in their votes than he is, or more liberal than in their votes than the person truly is. I'm going to skip this and move straight up to an interesting part of our analysis, which goes to essentially a theory of parties, because when you're thinking about parties, you want to actually speak to that literature. In that literature, there is a lot of discussion of where this party strength is coming from. And in our paper, we try to address that. What we show is essentially strong confirmation in our data of the conditional party government theory that basically shows that parties are weak when they are internally very heterogeneous. So when there is a lot of disagreement within the party, then the leadership gets lower delegated strength, lower ability to enforce, and that is confirmed generally in the data. Now, I'm out of time, so I don't want to go into the details, but just to show you, this is over time, the second moments of those distributions of Democrats and Republicans that I showed you, and peak variance for both parties is generally at the time of lowest party strength of for each party. We've done a lot of ancillary work here, but I'm not going to be able to talk to you about this. I'm out of time. I just want to conclude now. Why are we doing all this work on estimating this model? Because we wanted to understand how much of the current political mess is coming from the party leaders. How much of this responsibility can be directly attributed to the leadership in enforcing and implementing divisive strategies. And those divisions can be effectively enforced through whipping, through the use of selective use of party discipline. In order to do this, we had to decompose roll call votes, and that's the method that we present. Now, once you have done this, you can apply this methodology to other assemblies, to other parliaments. You can use it for state legislatures. In general, now you have some sort of approach to identifying these latent discipline parameters that you can use to understand party organizations, and which I think the personnel and organizational economics of parties is an interesting area for us to work on in political economy. And maybe having data like the ones that we present, these estimates, may be useful in that sense. I would like to thank you all, and I'm ready to take some questions from the audience.
Thanks so much, Francesco. That's fantastic. So who has questions? Maybe while you're all kind of thinking about questions, let me maybe chip in with one kind of very broad question. So, I mean, generally speaking, isn't it like, if you think in terms of welfare analysis, isn't this whipping kind of a bad thing, in the sense that you kind of do effort to move people around, but at the end of the day of the voting will be a zero-sum game. So it seems to me a bit like kind of contest, you know, with kind of you, the gain is kind of fixed, but then you kind of exercise costly effort. So wouldn't that call for maybe having secret voting for some decisions in terms of welfare? Yeah. So what's your take on that? I understand that it's completely outside the model, but
no, that's interesting. It's actually an endogenous rule, the one that you just described, where Congress decides whether votes should be secret or not. That is super important. There are some other legislative bodies that do have certain votes selectively being secret and others being open. In the U.S. Congress, roll calls are all essentially what they are, roll calls. So your vote is public knowledge. Yeah, so that's very, very interesting, and it would definitely change things in terms of the structure of carrots and sticks used by parties. Now, obviously, we know very well from our work on, from all the work in political economy and vote buying, that even secret ballots can be kind of circumvented, and you can imagine this party leaders have a way around that as well. But I think it's a very interesting question. It's
okay, thanks a lot for the answer. So in the meantime, have other people who wants to go next?
I can go next. I have a quick question. I really enjoyed the presentation, and I can't wait to see the method applied to other countries where it looks like polarization has been on the decrease, if anything. My question is regarding the tension between the party and the whip on one hand, and individual politicians on the other hand. And if I understand correctly, in the model, politicians' ideal points are fixed, the theta i's. So suppose you relax this assumption and you allow politicians to lie about the ideal points, and you more generally introduce uncertainty about individual politicians' ideal points. Then if I'm a Democrat on one particular bill, I'm on the other side. So I'm like closer to voting with a Republican. It looks like I would have an individual incentive to misreport my ideal points so that I don't get whipped and one of my colleagues gets whipped. And so my expectation would be that if you relax the assumption, then we could expect that as the strength of different parties, different party whips increases, this would be a force that would alleviate the increase in polarization, because now politicians, for instance, in the way in which they vote on previous bills, all the things that might convey a signal about where they stand, they would have an incentive. My example politician who is a bit closer to the Republican Party, even though he's a Democrat, he would have an incentive to lie and always vote aligned with the Republicans, so as not to be whipped on the bill that he cares about.
Well, this is an interesting point that we addressed more head-on in the other paper, where we were looking at some clear declarations from the party members to the political leadership, because we were looking at whip counts. And in the context of whip counts, this is super important, because you're making a statement about your intentions to vote, and you may say, but what happens if you are, because it's really not an issue of ideal point, is more an intention to vote, which is obviously a function of your ideal point. So in that particular case, we discussed what kind of equilibria you may be able to support where you do have systematic lying. Now, if you do have really a politician that has to go through this sort of almost systematic shading of their political position in order to obtain rents from the party, that kind of, you may expect that once in a while people lie about their position, to have that systematically going on, then it becomes very costly from the perspective of that politician. And that's where I think you can show that that cannot really be an equilibrium strategy. But we have discussed that extensively in our other work. And the idea here is, if you wish, think about this as really a long run game played between a politician and their leaders. And then it becomes much harder to systematically lie because of you have that kind of reputational structure that you need to maintain, and it's costly to maintain it over time.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks a lot. So there are three more people on the list I've seen who raised their hand. One is Sergey Guriev, John Landrigan, and Simeon Campos. I think I've seen Sergey's hand first. So maybe in this order, Sergey, and then John, and then Simeon, if you don't mind.
I would like to follow up on Vincent's question in the sense that it would be interesting to see how this model is applied to other countries with party entry, right? US is very unique in the sense that you don't have new parties or third parties entering, and polarization, of course, creates a space for such parties, either in this two-dimensional space or in an endogenously formed third dimension, right? So to what extent, I know it's not part of the paper, but to what extent you can kind of speculate that this trend, if it continues, may actually create an opportunity for a third party emerging, even in a country like US where barriers to entry are so high?
No, I think this is a very interesting point. So to me, the low-hanging fruit would be for someone to just take our model and our approach and use it for the UK. I think the UK would be a very good way of translating. Now, you may say, but party discipline is much stronger in the British Parliament, but less so of recent. And then you definitely have that kind of entry type of element there, or very much in line. So I do not want to speculate to other environments because, you know me, without data, I tend to be a little bit, but please do take this thing and make it yours in using it for the UK or maybe other countries where you imagine at least the electoral rule is comparable. I think that's kind of important in terms of incentives of politicians directly.
I would just react to that exactly as Vincent said. Maybe exactly because entry is possible in some European countries, the polarization is not happening to the extent because they're afraid of the entry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a different type of issue. It's a very important one. Yeah.
Okay, John, the floor is yours.
Your interpretation at the end suggests that, well, we found the culprits. We know the polarization is coming from these party leaders. But of course, the party leaders are chosen by the party rank and file. They serve at the pleasure of the House in some sense. And so I'm wondering whether it doesn't make sense to try to disentangle how much the party leadership is really dragging the party along and how much we're just looking at something that's almost epiphenomenal, which is the way in which the parties coordinate on being more polarized. Stephen N.S. Chung talked about people working in teams rowing cargo back 100 years ago. And apparently they would actually pay a pilot who would whip the oarsmen so that they would all work extra hard, and literally whip as opposed to whip with a capital W. And yet they chose that, right? The people rowing the boat chose to be disciplined. Basically, it was a commitment device to avoid shirking. And perhaps the party leadership that we're seeing in legislatures today isn't so much causing the problem of polarization as that there's simply the way in which the members coordinate on everybody jumping off the cliff together and taking the more extreme vote together.
No, to me, this is like the next step of the analysis. Once you do have some sort of sense of how important the role of this technology of enforcing things is, then you can understand why rules were changed in terms of, say, assigning committee seats or changing the rules for floor time and things like that in order to achieve this higher level of coordination. And obviously this is coming from somewhere. It's not random. We're not saying that this is this party discipline is exogenous. It's a technology that is generated within the party. Now, something must have happened when people of the likes of Newt Gingrich or Tom DeLay came in play and decided to change this technology. And we do have evidence that they did change this technology at a massive level, and this has consequences. Now, why do parties go for this divisive and more aggressive ways of organizing themselves? We don't know. We stop well short of that, not because we're lazy, it's because it's a very hard question to answer, and I think we're not at that point yet. But we do believe that the next stage would be, once you have this evidence, understand within the party why this is happening. And when we were thinking about conditional party government, we were thinking about that, trying to start opening up a little bit of the discussion of why, for instance, heterogeneity in preferences of members of parties seems to be systematically associated with weaker parties. And that kind of speaks directly to your delegation type of story, where the party members do, for some kind of objective, tend to guarantee more power, delegate more power to their leaders when they are more homogeneous, endogenously. So I really do believe that at this point, we really need to start having an organizational economics approach to this and understand where this is coming from within the party.
Okay, thanks so much. One question left by Simeon and 1 minute left. So, okay, here we go.
Yeah, hello. Thank you for your conference. I was wondering whether there could be like a theoretical upper bound of polarization, because if polarization is too extreme, there could be room for third party to capture like all the congressmen at the middle of the political scale. And yeah, do you have thoughts on this?
Well, I think this is a very interesting point. More general, I mean, most of the audience here is from Europe, and in Europe we have had this discussion on why in certain situations incumbent parties weren't able to change their policy position in a way to prevent entry by third parties. Why weren't they able to kind of capture the policy issues that made entry, for instance, on the part of populist parties more feasible? Why weren't they able to adjust? And in that sense, that's what you're saying exactly, that this polarization may come from may have an upper bound in terms of what kind of policies you can vote on, or what kind of divisiveness you can achieve before someone else comes in more in the middle, for instance. And I think that's a very interesting point to the economist in the audience here. It looks a lot like an industrial organization type of problem, where you do have, you know, the possibility of entry of firms in markets that have incumbent firms that cover a certain part of the product space. And I think it's a very interesting question to understand exactly whether these things actually work, whether you can actually do have that response. My sense is that no, there is no such upper bound, because we have seen plenty of entry in Europe. So obviously there was something that was not working in that sense, but I think it's an open question. I don't want to give answers that I cannot be confident about. So I really don't know, but I find it very interesting overall.
Okay, thanks so much. So I think you're really right. Perfect timing. So it was an amazing paper, super presentation, fantastic stuff. It was a big pleasure to listen to you. And thanks a lot for everybody to attend. We'll be back in autumn. We're at the moment, well, there will be a summer break, and we're kind of producing the program for autumn with another few kind of exciting talks. So looking forward to seeing all of you back. Thanks so much.